Welcome everyone to the Kunstlevin, and especially in this Saturday today is before Christmas, and to massage your brain with art instead with punch. And we have the great pleasure finally, after weeks of hard work, to open this fantastic exhibition with a fantastic artist and person who was very generous to work hard on that. And so you need just to wait a bit before entering in the world of Babette, even if you have already like a great preview here of the exhibition. So I would start this conversation, Babette, asking you a general question. I mean, more than question, like reflection on the way this exhibition has been organized. And so the show embraces basically most of what you have done till today. So includes a lot of images, photos documenting the theater, the dance, and sorry?
Not much performance, actually.
Not much performance, you're right. And theater, dance, photos. Good selection of your films. And 3 installations. Let's say the only thing is missing are the feature films you have worked on as a cinematographer. So films of Chantal Akerman, so the exhibition is like a large sort of choreography, which turns in a way each object, each element, into a sort of performative sort of movement. And so we try to keep the same attitude of your work, which is improvising or create a movement within a set of parameters, which in a way we can connect to a figure that for you was a kind of godfather, who is Georges Perec. And here we have this sort of personal atlas. And Georges Perec is one of the first photo we have in the first shelf. He's also one of the first photo you have ever taken. So, yeah. So I think we can start from here and to think about how this exhibition works. What are the rules of the game, as Perec would say?
I'm going to start with objecting to Godfather, because Georges was only 5 years older than me and we were on equal term. Although I was still a little bit younger than him, because I met him at 19 and was 24. But you see what I mean? It's like he was not my godfather.
A close friend.
He was a close friend. Yeah.
Influential friend.
To give you something which is totally personal and make no sense if I don't explain it to you, the first shelf, it's a shelf which is about my life in Paris. And the reason there's a card game is because I spend literally 2 to 3 hours, at least twice a week, if not 5 hours twice a week, to play cards with Georges, his wife, and other friends. We were playing cards constantly. We went to weekend in the country and play cards literally non-stop. And the people who were losing were actually the one having to go out, do the dishes, and buy the food, and cook the food. And therefore could not play cards during that time. I'm not joking. So we have that in common, and some of it you can trace actually in the writing of Georges, because you know the name Margoldt is there somewhere in Le Vimov d'Emploi. So I don't know if you know his work, but he's a very important writer, and he's much more important now than he's dead since 1982 than probably. I mean, the resonance of his work is important because he problematized the idea of categorization and how to organize data, basically, and it's what corporations now are built on. So you could say then his approach to vocabulary, play with word, and narration is very much preoccupied with something which is at the base of what has transformed our world in the last 30 years or so. And to continue explaining a little bit the trajectory, for instance, I don't know if you know the face of Georges Perec, but he is in another instance in the shelf, which is the 1990, because there I read again, it was a friend I mourn dearly, and a lot of his writing was published after his death. So Pensée classée, which means to think and to sort out, if you want, in English, is a book which I read around 1990 when I made a film which is dedicated to Georges Perec. And next to it there is a book by a German Jew who lived in Leipzig, and Leipzig or Dresden, I think. And Hitler, and wrote that text, which I find absolutely fascinating, which is about how language is perverted for political reason. And it's so true to the English language in the world I live in, you know, because I live in America since 1971. So that perversion of the language that the political side is doing, it's a project for me that I want to do. I don't know when, but I really wanted that to be there, you know, because it's a reference which is anchoring a lot of what I'm thinking of doing and don't always do, but some of it resurface in work which is currently here in the gallery, actually. And the remaining part here, you see some things which are reference to photographs which were seen earlier but presented differently. And you have also a catalogue of a very important show for me, Century City at Tate, because that's the first major group show where I was selected to represent with another photographer the New York City at the time they showcased in that show, Century City, which was 68-74. And it was so interesting because the other photographer, Peter Moore, who is very well known too, and I knew very well, had a style which was so different, I never realized the differences until I saw the show. So it definitely affected the way I thought, going back to my photo archive, to produce work for it, yeah. To produce new work, if you want, because my archive of photography, I sealed it. I mean, I stopped taking photography in '85, you know. I'm a filmmaker, I make film, and now I make installation, but using sometime old photograph or new photograph. But that sense then, you know, you can still reactivate an archive which is not constantly nourished with new work is kind of interesting, and I reflected a lot on that, and that has created, I think, the most interesting work and the reason so many people have been writing about that kind of work. So I think I'm better known now as somebody who has done performance photography, performance in a general sense, than actually a film, which is a bit sad for me. And I thank Luca enormously, and obviously the Kunsthalle and everybody here, who actually decided then to really showcase my work. Film was at the center of it. So when you enter in the room of the Kunsthalle, you are going to see an empty space, and the space is activated when not totally empty. Don't worry, there's still things on the wall you can see, but there's also screens which are waiting to be occupied by a film. And what is film? It's the manipulation of time, it's sound, and it's things which constantly go a little bit faster than you can comprehend it, and you have to comprehend it on the go. So basically, it creates an activity which is an activity of memorizing and putting together, if the film is 90 minutes, what you have seen in the first 10 minutes and what you see now in the 40 to 50 minutes and so on. You constantly measure what you have just seen to what you are seeing now. So basically, it's an activity which is very different from the one of looking at photograph. Because if you look at one photograph, there is only one thing. And if the context is not in the photograph, and most of the time you don't want to have any context, you want the photograph to stand totally on its own and have no reference of when it was taken. And because actually, if the photograph is interesting, it would be much more durable that way. So in many ways, photographs have no time attached to them and no spatial context, except maybe they can represent depth and they represent a certain space. So architecture is certainly very important in my photography, but
yeah, sorry, but I would just explain that what you referred to the films and how we decide to show. Basically, we work on the opening hours of the Kunsthalle, and we created an exhibition as a score made of sound and your film. So basically we have a sequence of sound intervals and films, so 13 different films on 3 screens. So there is it's always a sequence, one work or sound per time. So everything is continuously shifting from one screen to another. And when there are the sound intervals, the sound can be listened in all the space. So basically, you as spectator, in a way, you are obliged to follow the rhythm of the exhibition, and which is totally the opposite experience of an ordinary one in an exhibition, where usually you enter in a space where there is a display of art objects, and you decide the time to spend to look at them, and so usually you stroll through it. Here, of course, you can decide to live as in a cinema or in a theater, but it's an exhibition with a precise length, which is like 6 hours and something.
6 hours, 40 minutes, but you are not, nobody will stay 6 hours, 40 minutes. But if you come back at a different time, a week later, you will see a very different exhibition for 2 reasons. Because you will not arrive at the same time, that's the assumption at least. Therefore, you will not get to see the portion of the time you stay there, like 2 hours or 2.5 hours, will be at the same time of the cycle. But what is very interesting, I discovered that yesterday and the day before when we finished installing, and the sound of film is actually heard in the room in which there is no film, and you have installation which have no sound but have visual images and have plenty of things to look at, and which are very different. The 3 installations are very different. There is an installation which is made of 2 parts with color. There is an installation which is a reflection on staging in space, in theater and performance. And there is another one which is pondering about filmmaking, how you think the subject matter of a film. And the sound of the film, which is in the hall, if there is sound, not every film has sound, many films are also silent, but if there is sound, it's actually heard when you are looking at something which has nothing to do with the film. And I find that very interesting because it creates an element of distraction, but at the same time, if you have seen the film, it makes you recall, and that system of recall is, I think, for me, so key to looking at film. It's so important in looking at film. I think you never know what a film signified until you have seen it in its entirety, but the possibility for you to recall what you have seen makes that sense is generated from it. And I think it can happen when you're actually looking at something else, which also needs to be understood and make sense of. So,
going back to the Century City image, this idea of the city you study in Paris cinematography, and you were one of the few women also to study and to be a camera, to do that specific kind of job. Even like women directors at the time, there were very few. And then you moved to New York in 1970. And so I have two questions. First question, how did the city look like? So what was your first impression when you arrive? And that in a way we have also, in the exhibition, we can get a sense of the city. And then the second I forgot. So in the meanwhile, you can start to reply with the first one.
So Paris is actually a very beautiful city. I suppose some of you have gone there, if not many of you. And
sorry, it's the reason why you went to New York. So basically, very often you say that the reason why.
Yeah.
Okay, you tell the. This was the second question.
So when you live in Paris, you're totally secure. You know, nobody is going to snatch your bag. I mean, sometime in the subway late at night in the 60s. I'm not speaking of today, but and today I think it's perfectly fine too. But there could have been some violence, and especially in the late 50s, early 60s, because that was the end of the Algerian War, so there was a lot of, there was even a bomb and terrorism and whatever, you know, and I was living in Paris at that time. I was starting to go at the university and so on. So, but the sense of violence was not really present. But in '68, you know, we had this kind of revolution in May '68, and Paris became almost a lockdown city, and I hated it. So, because I was constantly checked, and when you are a French citizen, you need to have your ID paper with you, because if you don't have it, the police can put you in jail to interrogate you. So when I arrived in New York, I discovered you don't need to have ID paper. If a policeman asks you, you say, my name is Babette Mangolt. I live so-and-so. I'm just here for a visit, and they cannot tell you anything, you know. They have to believe you. If you lie, you go to jail, but they have to prove you lie. You know? You don't need to have an ID. So it was a true liberation to be in New York. But New York was then a very violent city, and everybody had told me, don't go there, you are going to be mugged, and I was mugged, you are going to be robbed, and I was robbed. All of that was true. So, you know, there was a sense of freedom to be in the US, but there was also a level of violence I was not expecting, yeah. So that's, but I will not live anywhere else than in a city. You will never see me in the countryside, although I love to go there for a visit, you know, and I like nature, and I like to walk in the middle of the desert, nowhere, with nobody around me, and I can think, you know, but that's different.
The reason why you moved there is also connected to an author, to a filmmaker, then you will work with, who is Michael Snow.
Yes. I wrote that actually in a text which will be published in the catalog. It's a kind of amusing story, but Michael Snow made a film. He's a famous sculptor and also filmmaker, and he's really very, very well known. Now he's probably 84 years old, is that it? Something like that? Yeah. He's also a musician, a jazz musician. He do improvisation with a group in Toronto every week. And he made a film in '67 called Wavelength, 45 minutes, which can be described very summarily as being a zoom, a 45-minute zoom, and nothing happened. But actually, if you see the film, it's not a good description. But a friend of mine, which trained me, also a filmmaker in Paris, named Marcel Hanoun, in '67 had a film in competition at the same film festival than Michael Snow with Wavelength. Michael Snow won the prize of the Experimental Film Festival of Knock-le-Zout, which is in Belgium. And when Marcel came back and told me, you know, that film, it's a Zoom, nothing happened. I don't understand. And I edited the film, which was in competition, which I thought was very nice. It was on Gaudi. You know, Gaudi is a great architect which built La Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. So, and he's a very eccentric man, and also he built a garden, which is, I forgot the name of the garden, but if you have gone to Barcelona, you could not have missed Gaudi. And therefore, the film was full of, it was a classical film, if you want. There was no commentary. It was essentially a visual film. And Marcel speaking Spanish, there was some conversation of people in the park, but there was no explanation. It was not a classical art documentary. It was much better, okay? But Michael Snow film was original, but I see, it's kind of amazing. Somebody else described to me the film so differently. I say I have to make up my mind, why is it so different? The other reason I wanted to go to New York to see experimental film work, which you could not see in Paris at the time, because I had seen some, thanks to Noël Birch, and I felt then I had to find another context to reflect on what I could do in terms of film. Because in France, I was blocked. I could not enter the film industry. Nobody wanted to work with a woman as an assistant camera. And you cannot become a DP if you are not an assistant camera first. So I was trained on 4 feature film by Marcel Hanoun on his feature film as an assistant camera, but after 4, I was ready to do work myself. So I decided to go to other pasture to see if there was an option. And indeed, without really thinking it would be possible, the first year I was in New York, the second year, Yvonne Rainer wanted to have a camera woman, and I was recommended to her. And I shot her first film, and the film did wonderfully well. It's actually a marvelous film, Lives of Performer. I shot it, and I became a name as a cinematographer. And Marcel sent me Chantal Ackerman in New York, who also wanted to work with a woman cinematographer. And Chantal was younger than me, but you know, we felt the same thing. We felt we cannot work in a system which is managed by men. We are not interested in what we do and think we cannot make film. We are not going to be responsible or whatever. So we felt alike, and many other women felt the same way in the early 70s, you know. So many women felt then they had to work together to invent a kind of language to represent them, to represent women. One of the reasons Delphine Seyrig ended up to act in the film of Chantal Ackerman, who made their reputation, also a film I shot, so he made, in a way, my reputation as well. Jeanne Dillman, 23 Quai du Commerce, 1080 Bruxelles, in English, 23 Quai of Commerce, 1080, which is the zip code Bruxelles, is a film where the main actress, which is in every shot, is Delphine Seyrig. And Delphine was a feminist and wanted to work mostly with women. So, you know, those things did not happen by accident, in a way. I'm very lucky to arrive in New York at a time where feminism was starting. Yeah. I was definitely helped by it. I mean, I would be nowhere if I hadn't... if I had stayed in France, I would be nowhere.
Even if I have every time they ask about to Chantal Ackerman if she was a feminist, she always saying that she was, if she was a feminist filmmaker, she always say, I'm a woman and I make films. So she was also
I perfectly agree. I do the same thing. If somebody, I never competed in Women Film Festival. I thought it was an insult. If I cannot compete with men, I don't want to. You know, I don't want to be selected in a minority. And I felt that was really important, yeah.
And I found also in an interview of Yvonne Rainer. So Yvonne Rainer shot these 2 films where you work as a camera woman.
DP, yeah.
DP.
I also edited the movie,
Live of Performance and But basically, after the premiere of this film, Yvonne Reiner said that she underlined how she really needed deal more specifically with emotion, and that was the main reason of her moving from dance to film. And funny enough, she mentioned that she mentioned Martha Graham and Jean-Luc Godard as the responsible for her leaving the circus. And so my question is about Godard, because you also, Chantal Ackerman, you always were a bit sort of critical of him, and so it's interesting that Yvonne, as a kind of feminist, in her feminist position, basically mentioning him as a main influence at the time, which was, I think, a bit different from today, where I think with the sort of historical distance, I think also maybe your judgment is a bit different.
You know, for me, my first impression of Jean-Luc Godard started with À bout de souffle, which I saw in '60. Okay, I was just starting to go to the movie, and I did not like the film at all. And I must say, I'm often in contradiction with my future self, because now I adore the film. But the film is extremely misogynist, you know, and I think that misogyny was disturbing me a little bit, but I thought the film was also a kind of play on American film, which did not particularly interest me. You know, I prefer the American film than the Godard version of it. So, and I was not particularly interested in the new wave. I mean, you know, you still have, and I had told you to change it, but you still have somewhere. Then I was influenced by the new wave in whatever, the bonjour. Okay, don't believe the bonjour. So anyway, because...
We always need mistakes to make...
Yes, I know.
To achieve perfection.
I don't blame you for it, okay? I don't blame anybody for it. It's too tempting to say that. Because if nobody knows anything about cinema, you still know the new wave existed at some point, and that's it. It's a reference which is vague, you know. But for me, I learned film by accident, by living next to the French Cinematheque, and it was very cheap. If you had a student card, you were paying, no, I'm not joking, you were paying 1 centime, 1 cent, to go to the movie at 6, 1 cent to go to the movie at 8, 1 cent to go to the movie at 10. So, you know, 6 hours of movie for only 3 centimes. And I had not much money at that time, you know. My father was dead. I was earning my living teaching mathematics to a high school student, and I did not think it was, I did it well, you know. They passed their baccalaureate with no problem, but, you know, just... I could not go to cinema, which cost a lot of money. But at the Cinematheque, what you saw? You saw Soviet cinema, you saw film from Japan, you saw silent cinema, you saw film from any period, and mostly not contemporary film. You saw mostly classic film. And I discovered also how much you were gaining by looking at a film more than once. And, you know, if I liked the film, so one of the first films I saw several times, because they were playing it probably once a year, it's Dziga Vertov, and it's the movie camera. It's totally, if there is a film with Wavelength, which changed my life, Wavelength got me to New York, because a friend of mine told me, described me in Avignon, in France, therefore, you know, in '69, described me the film so differently than Marcel had described it to me 2 years before. Then I say, my God, I have to know what's happening, and why somebody can tell me something which is so interesting about something which somebody else dismissed. And the two people were actually friends, and you know, were both intelligent. So it's not a question of taste. There was something else there, and I thought it was kind of interesting to discover. And
so you arrive in New York, and so thanks to Annette Michelson, so one of the great film and art critic, also one of the founding members of editors of October magazine. You got to know Yvonne Rainer. And without having a knowledge in terms of dance, theater, so just spending time looking at this, then you start to build up your knowledge, so by looking. And I'm interested to know, let's say that the threshold between documenting something and adding your personal interpretation, what you see, it's very subtle. And so usually it's hard to distinguish, what when a photo is a pure documentation or when that photo is your own, in a way, work. And but you very often stress how important for you was to take these photos to save for the future these very ephemeral, time-based works. And but the way you documented all these amazing works was very different compared to other photographers. You mentioned Peter Moore, who basically the archive of Peter Moore is huge. Basically, was always on every exhibition,
we
performance,
were always
but
photographing the same thing.
the same thing.
But
But the
very
way,
differently.
very different. Especially talking about the dance photographs you took, you always wanted to, for example, to go to rehearsal, so to know the thing in advance. So you wanted to study before taking photos. And also and is something which is clearly visible when you look at your photos. Also for you, what was very important was to give back a sense of the space. So very often the photos are frontal. So, and it's very hard to give at the same time a sense of sort of movement, space, and time. And I think you achieve, especially in some photos, like, I don't know, Roof Piece is really like an incredible photo. You can spend 10 minutes and there is a whole narrative within that, and it's such a sort of impossible task to document such a performance, such a choreography.
Yeah.
So then I think it's also interesting that, of course, the work and all this discussion about filming for the camera or taking photos for the camera, or this discussion about what is documentation, what is not, is a discussion started to evolve in the last 15 years, and is connected also to the fact that all these people like Yvonne Rainer, Simon Forti, John Jonas became like part of our history. So because you have big retrospective exhibition, and usually in these exhibitions you see photos to document certain works that otherwise, or you have a film or you have that photo, otherwise it's just a oral history. And so the question is about your perception about that. What's your feeling about that? And also, and I think, how do you consider those photos? For you, they're more sort of incredible documents, so made in a fantastic way, beautiful images, but then documents at the end, or works? Not to create a category, but you understand what I mean.
I will say that when I shot the photograph at first, I shot them essentially because few people were there to look at the work. And I say, indeed, if I photograph something, the photograph will be there, and people can see the photograph later if they want to, and there will be a trace, okay? But some of my photographs I absolutely adore, you know. I adore the photograph of Trisha Brown, which is here, because I sold the film of Watermorder to 5 museums, and now there's no more print to sell, unfortunately. The one which is that dance here, because it's such an amazing photo. You know, you look at it, Trisha's feet off the ground, and she's pushing the left arm in one way and the right arm on the other. So she's jumping up, and at the same time, half of her body is going in one direction and the other. And you know, I don't see many photographers doing that, but for me, it's also a fluke, you know? I mean, I reshot that photograph 3 times, in 3 different times, so I always shoot at the same moment, so it's not totally a fluke. But the photograph is really fascinating to look at, you know? So I shot that in 78. It's so long ago, I've forgotten what I was doing in 78. I shot a very important movie for Richard, for instance. I refused to join the union because I say I don't want to become a DP for life, and I rather make my film on landscape than, you know, be forced to work for certain crummy filmmaker. So you see what I mean? It's like the photograph, when I shot it, it was nothing. I was doing it because I was preparing shooting a film. But now that I see that picture, I like it so much. I love my picture. You have no.
What was the circulation of those images at that time? Because now in the museums they are shown very time framed, they're even like sold in a market, which is.
Yeah, not much, but a little bit.
At that time, what was the circulation of those images? Going to
well,
in magazines?
Those images, no, that images did nothing. I mean, I kept it, and it was reproduced a couple of times.
They were reproduced, like making
somebody
magazines.
write a piece on Trisha, and now, you know, 13 of my photographs of Trisha are going to be in a brochure at UCLA. I wrote the email today signing, signing the condition and whatever. And some of the picture, one is this one, and one is the first one I took at Latico Gallery in Rome when I saw Trisha for the first time.
So also here in the shelf, but then also in the space, the same image, you can see the same image different times in different size and also within different contexts. So this importance of thinking about the act of looking and to really question the role of the spectator, I think is the reason why also your work is so actual and relevant today, because we live in a time totally dominated by images and where everything is filtered by images, but then our relationship with those images is very sort of like snapshot, is more like a scrolling down with spending less than 1 second to look at it, while your work is totally like suggesting the opposite. It's really like asking and making each of us like aware of how important is really like to look at, and what are the difference also on the way of looking.
Yeah, but the format of the slideshow, it's actually what you have in your iPhone. So you can play, and in general, you use your finger. So you do 1, 2, 3, 4, and because some pictures are bad and you don't want to, junk them yet. And but in general, you go fast because you scan, basically. You don't really look, you scan. And in the show here, you are going to see 3 slideshows, all very different, and there's a film which is made like a slideshow, just with still photograph. Oh no, actually, it's not made with just still photograph. It's made with 1 photograph, which is 10 minutes long, and the rest is manipulation of photograph, which you see then you can in a place where you cannot manipulate them in the installation. So it's really a film. But there is, in addition, 3 slideshows, which is just still photograph. But it's not 1 second. It's something in which I decide then one photograph will be there for 4 seconds, another one for 8 seconds. So I'm modifying the rhythm, and I construct the temporality and of sequence, if you want, which an even length of time, which is, I think, very interesting, because obviously I go by accretion, you know. I start with cutting as I see fit, and I look at it, and this one is too long, so I'm going to shorten. So I project, and I go back and redo it. So I'm not doing it in one go. I really think of the duration in relationship with each other. So I think that's the reason now I have made 4 slideshows. The first one in 2010, and 3 for Vienna. Actually, one specifically for Vienna, and the other one is connected to the installation touching. And you know, I think the one which is specifically Vienna is a reflection on painting, and it's not associated with any other thing. It's about color, but you know, I have been thinking then it was actually interesting to do, because so much of the practice of photography now is the one of the slideshow, except the slideshow is made by us, me. I have an iPhone 7, which takes very good photograph, I think. I mean, you know, not as good as my real camera, but not bad, not bad. So I feel then, you know, if you're interested in the kind of rhythm you see in the way I manipulate photograph, you could copy it. Why not? Try to do slideshow, which are not one to but this one I look longer. This one I go fast, and so on and so on. Modify the rhythm, because I think what is the most interesting is for me is this idea. Then tiny difference is what really counts in life, and also that's what art is about. There's not much difference with the Sunday painter and Johann Vermeer or whoever, you know. I mean, there's a big difference, but you have to know where that difference is. And I think if I can sensitize you in my work to those minute differences, I will have done something useful to your life and will give you pleasure. I really think my work is supposed to give pleasure to the people who look at it. I'm not somebody who do work to criticize the world. Actually, I even discussed that in one of my scripts in the installation, fragment and filmmaking.
So you did your first film in 1975.
No, I shot it
What?
73, 74. I finished the 3rd of January.
Okay,
75.
So in mid-70s, while you already started to take like photos of Yvonne, Trisha Brown, Foreman, you did your first film, but also in 1978 you did your first sort of installation at the PS1, and I think then that installation, which was basically an installation made of hundreds of photos displayed following a precise order on a wall. There was a fence in front, so basically you can only like look at that from a precise distance, and then there was a table, a long table with images with printed as play cards, so again the reference to Georges Perec. So basically you had a totally different relationship to the same images, because in one you were just playing as spectator. But then when you had the table with the images that you can touch and reassemble, then you take the position of the photographer, which is in a way a similar kind of double parallel structure of La Camera Jeune de Cameraille. So you did this installation. What's the story of this installation? Because then you started again, only in 2000 you start to make installations dealing with the images of your archive, also your recent history. And all these installations, as we will see, they are continuously, you're every time treating your own images as different sort of ingredients that you can every time like use in a different way, every time to use to reflect on different subjects. That could be landscape, urban environment, dance, performance, but I think it's interesting that you did it already in 1978, and so I was curious to know how that happened. That installation was an exhibition. How long it was?
Okay, PS1 gave us studio to artists which were writing a proposal, and not everybody who wrote a proposal got a studio, but I got one. So the condition was we had 3 months a free studio at PS1, which was in the same location it is now, but now it's the same building basically, and you could work there, but the last month had to be an open studio and people were supposed to come and see. Okay. So the reason I applied to that is because I was so broke and I had something like $25,000 of debt because I had spent much more money than I had raised for Camera Jeu. And Camera Jeu was selected when it was finished by the Museum of Modern Art, which actually even bought a copy of it the following year, but the price they paid was not enough to pay my debt. So I say, okay, I cannot make a film for another year at best. And I had plenty of jobs, so I was earning good money, you could say, but it took a long time to pay $25,000 of debts. So I say, okay, I have all these extra photographs. Then I printed for Camera Jeu, so I should do something with it. And I thought then, you know, if I wanted to reflect, Camera Jeu is a reflection on how you shoot photograph, and PS1 installation is a reflection on how you look at photograph from the position of a spectator. And I thought what was very interesting, because, you know, I arrived in a country which was still, in 70, the US was a country which was still very affected by the consciousness, which I'm sure still exists in Europe, in many, in particular in France, and I'm sure in Austria too. The idea then there's rule to follow, you know, you have to follow the rule. Actually, I heard that yesterday.
In Austria, it's very present.
Yes, I'm sure it's very present, but it's very present in France, there's no shame. You know? But now it's not the case in New York. Nobody will ever tell that to you. But, you know, the people who could fend against that sense of there's rule and you have to follow the norm were around John Cage. And all the people who have discussed so far were people who were influenced by Cage, because Cage devised that philosophy of chance and haphazardness to actually break the idea they were norm. And I found that, and my English was very little when I arrived. I spoke maybe 50 words, so for me, I understood that later. But I understood immediately then the people I was seeing, like Michael Snow, Stan Brakhage, two filmmakers, later, you know, Richard Foreman, very influenced by film, Jonas Mekas, which are Richard is the first person I really photographed in terms of performance, was not following rules. And that's the reason I found that, because in France everybody was, so I found that so liberating. Oh, I'm sorry. I found that so liberating, basically. So I think this idea then, you know, I wanted to, in the installation, I wrote a way of using the installation. I say you can enter and look at the view and not even look at the photograph and leave. You can stay there for 2 hours and play card and play with your friend, bring your friend and play a game of card. Why not? There was a card game there, you know. So I invented all those things then people could do, and they could decide not to do it or to do it. So I was giving them rules they could break or they could not follow. And I thought that was really the main reason to make the thing, to do something which is interactive and give choice to people. Now, believe it or not, in the 90s, I had a student, since the beginning of the 90s, I teach in the university. I had a student who would tell me, she was really smart, actually, I love her, she was black, and I said, oh my God, I hope she's not going to have trouble. And to find a living in the film industry. She wanted to work in the film industry, but she managed, actually. She ended up to be a specialist of fancy makeup for monster figure. And she became very well known, so made money and was happy. So I'm really happy for her. But in any case, she told me something which I thought was amazing. She told me, you know, we have too much choice. And that was only in 95. But imagine now, everybody has so much choice that they don't even want to have choice. They want to have rules which permit them not to think, you know? So I find that very interesting. I think the world is changing so quickly, you know. So now I'm really happy because I redid that installation in 78. I redid it in 2010, and it was at the Whitney, and it was bought by Tate. And I must say, if you want to see it, you can, because I just learned 2 days ago. Then Tate is going to reinstall it in July. In July 2017, and it will be there for a full year. So at some point you will go to London, I hope, and you can see it.
So it seems that...
And now it's transformed, because obviously we don't care about choice. So in 2010, I changed. It's not that I changed the rule of the game. I explained that the rule of the game made in 78 had to be shifted because 2010 was not the same. I suppose 2017, I don't think I want to change it. And actually the date, I'm sure will not want, you know. They want to buy the authentic.
So basically, I would like to talk at least for other 2 hours. But I have another question before, because
yes.
It seems that we have to stop, you know.
I see, okay.
I would like to continue. But we have...
for me,
I have a question. I mean, I have a question about the idea of reenactments, because among the 13 films we chose to screen, because you did the first 3 films you did in the 70s are about this idea of subjective camera. Sorry. In the 80s, instead, your interest was really focused on the idea of landscape. Then in 90s, 2000, you did films about other artists. And there is a beautiful film about the great Polish artist Edward Krasinski, shot in the house, museum studio in Warsaw that I warmly suggest to visit, because it's really incredible place. And then you shot this 4 by Morris.
4 by Morris was done in 93.
Yeah, in fact,
90, 2000. It's the first
2000.
reenactment of performance, yeah.
And then also in 2000, you film The Roof Piece by Trisha Brown.
No. 2011.
Yeah, I'm just saying the 2000s, in the
see.
decade, I didn't remember.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm very bad with dates.
I'm very good with dates.
Yeah, that's why I'm pretty vague, and so you can correct me. So, but the question is about this. So, talking about 4 by Morris is a film where basically Bob Morris, at the time when he was together with Simon Forti, very influenced by Simon Forti, Bob Morris did 4 performances. They were married.
In San Francisco.
He did four very significant performances. That
but
in the 60s,
in New York. Yeah.
But you were not in New York.
No.
But so basically, in the 90s, agree with him. Basically, there was a reenactment of these 4 performances only for the camera. Then we have the Roof Piece by Trisha Brown, which is a work that you had seen, you film, you photograph. So basically you film again after many years. And then we have the 7 Easy Pieces by Marina Abramovic. That is another film. I think it's interesting because there are in each of these work you have different examples of reenactments, because in the case of Marina Abramovic, you are filming an artist who is doing reenactments of other artists. 4 by Morris are reenactments for the camera, but of works that you never saw
Yeah.
live, and
But,
then Roof Peace. So I think there is a kind of complex and so layering of
I will say there is a
time
huge difference
on it.
between Four Pieces by Morris and Seven Easy Pieces by Marina Abramovic. And I like both films very much than I did. And I like both artists also, which obviously my contact with them is very different. In one case, I knew Bob Morris' work since, Annette Michelson was a friend of mine, was writing a catalog essay in 1970 when I arrived in New York on Morris. So I saw his work immediately when I arrived. I had no idea. I thought that was interesting, but I'm not sure I could place his culture because I had no background, but I could, and obviously I also did all the visualization, the frame enlargement of the Castelli catalog, film catalog. So, and there were 3 or 4 films by Morris. So I looked at those films and I decided which image will represent the film in a catalog, because they were letting me do that, and that's how I could pay money to do my film, What Bézinou, by the way, So I'm really grateful to Castelli to have given me an income to do report work, because I also saw films that were somewhat interesting. So I kind of knew a little bit of Morris, and I had seen shows of him in the course of between the 70s and the 90s when Rosalind Krauss was the curator of a retrospective of his and thought there was no way the retrospective could be done without showing some of his performance. So obviously I was the obvious choice to show that because I had a sense of the aesthetic of his period. I could read by then very well the English language. So I read his text, and he's somebody who is, very, very smart and has written very interesting text. And we hit it off. And the reenactment is not really of mine. The reenactment is made by Bob, who actually trained the performer he used to replace him because he could not manipulate the plywood of site the way he had done it when he was 30 years old. And he needed to have somebody who could do it. So he trained that person. So each time he was training Ando Lutke, who is in the film, I was there with a little video camera and I was shooting saying, I'm going to see where I'm positioned to see the movement. And exactly like I was shooting with a still camera, Trisha doing Roof Piece, to figure out how I could shoot that with a movie camera, So in many ways, Bob Morris is the one who reenacted to his satisfaction with the people he cast to play primarily his part in the first 2 performances. And performance 21-3, it's his voice, and he's somebody who actually is Frank Stella's son playing him, and that was his casting. And in the case of Waterman's Switch, which is the 4th performance, Lucinda Child, which was in the original performance, recommended 2 dancers. And for me, that was the wrong. The 2 dancers were both gay, so they were naked next to each other, and they were so fucking skinny, they could not stand for Bob Morris and Yvonne Rainer were sleeping together and were a couple, so that was a mistake.
I have a question as
I'm
well.
sorry.
No,
I'm sorry.
You don't need to be sorry at all. I have a question related to the future. If you look into your future and into our future, have you ever worked on a novel?
Me writing a novel?
Why? Yeah, so it's absolutely fascinating.
No, I don't want to write a novel. I just want to write a book on still photography.
Yeah,
and
that's
I can
the same,
tell you, and I can tell you that show is the beginning of writing my book. You have to figure it out when you see the show. But I'm absolutely, and that too, because if you see at that, there's all the different kind of paper you can find existing, silver-based paper, digital paper, crummy paper, etc., in this series of shelf. And I did that purposely, you know. I wanted to see something which is mixing and matching things which are not archivally compatible and which are not archivally coherent. Yeah.
Extremely fascinating to listen, not only to listen to you, also to feel you talking about the passage of time and how you combine
because
the past with the
I
present.
think the idea of reenactment is really important because, you know, I think performance, I really believe Marina is right. Performance is the body of the performer. Performance art, and I don't think theater, but theater is the same. Theater needs the presence of an actor, you know, and a Shakespeare play exists with John Gielgud, who now is dead, so he cannot play Hamlet anymore. But somebody else can play Hamlet, maybe not as well as him. And obviously the time has changed. We are not in the 1930s now. So you see what I mean? So there is certain work which have to be reactualized with new performance and new performer, new actors. But nobody had thought that performance art was the same thing than theater. And actually, you know why I think about that? Because I never thought about it before. It's because Bob Morris told me I wanted to do theater. And everybody, when he did his performance, they were in gymnasium. They had no money. They were going to the gymnasium of the Judson's shirt. They were doing in place we were lit with fluorescent and has a crummy wire in the background. And the photograph, you know, are not pristine. I mean, when I do photograph, you know, I try to avoid things in the background where, you know, the little punctum, like Bart is saying, which is going to attract our attention and distract us from the subject. If I do a picture of Trisha, I want to make sure you see only Trisha, you know, but you have a sense of the space where she moves because a dancer moves in a space, so you have to show the space. So you do an horizontal framing, not vertical, you know. But what?
It's absolutely fantastic. Really great to look at both of you. And to,
I have a last question. How did you Babette? How did you feel when with Roof piece of Trisha Brown?
But I would like to finish my point with No, you ask a question after.
Okay, a quick question.
Marina established the idea that basically performances are copyrighted by the original artist. But, you know, I'm not a dummy either. I had seen the Vito Acconci piece. I discovered all through documentation. You know, Gina Pane, I think a really important artist, from Italian, but mostly worked in France. So there was at Pompidou a show in 2005, which I saw in April or something like that, even before Marina contacted me to shoot the movie, you know, because I was interested in performance history. So and I had seen Boyce, obviously, several times, because Richard Serra, who is a friend of mine, loved Boyce, so I was always going because, you know, it could be interesting. And I think if you ask me, Marina totally misread Boyce, did a wonderful job with Vito Acconci, which is not at all in the spirit of Acconci. She did something totally in perversion of it, but that was wonderful. She did an Nauman piece, which was just a text, and she totally transformed the content of it. That I know because of Chris, what is her name? The film curator at the Whitney. Oh my God, I have a senior moment. Chris Isle. Yeah, she's a really interesting woman, yeah. She explained to me a lot of things about
because
Douglas
the exhibition
Gordon.
at Guggenheim that you're referring to, 7 easy pieces, consisted
in
of a
2005.
week-long exhibition where every day Marina Abramovic
So if you
performed,
want-
reenacted a different work, the different performance by
She took
different
liberty
artists.
with the work. In other words, in the case of 4 Pieces by Morris, Morris restaged for himself in the 90s something he had done earlier. And for me, I felt, and everything was coded because all the soundtrack existed. So we had the duration because we had the sound. And that was great, because I think the big difference, you know, I'm also an historian because of training of my family, but I really feel that what is so valuable, is the sense of time of the 60s, is not the sense of time of today. you know, and I'm trying to give you in my slideshow, to go back to my example of flipping very quickly a photograph after the other, you know, I want to give you a sense of more leisure to take time to look.
Yes, but you don't live in the past.
What?
You don't live in the past, and your work is not related only to the 1960s.
No, I constantly situate myself in the today's world. Look, I'm situating myself
In,
past that fucking,
yeah, for president.
So I wonder what I'm going to do, you know, I don't know. I have to,
Not a novel, a fiction, please.
yeah. No,
Last
I'm not
question.
going to do
Your
it.
last question, but that is connected to your
Oh,
feeling.
yes.
How did you feel when you film like Roof Piece of Trisha Brown after how many years? More than 35 years.
It's a very different piece. So for me, the piece which is called Roof Piece, which engaged 13 dancers or 12 dancers, which are in the city, outside, and have to be in sight of the dancer next to them because they copy. Somebody send a movement which is copy. And the distance between the space between the two dancers make the movement cannot be copied exactly. So the end of the line has some discrepancy, if you want. But it works so differently in 73 than in 2011. And, you know, for a filmmaker, the way you compose, I mean, it's what Kamara just showed you, the way you compose the background and the foreground, it's so different. So for me, there is no relationship between one and the other. But it's what, oh my God, my film is going already. Oh, that's great.
Yes, that's...
Maybe we should stop. And you
Yeah, we should
go.
stop and go because
Thank you
that's
so
already
much.
started.
Great.
Oh.